Hey there, friend. Glad you came for the storm tonight. Let the rhythm of the rain guide you in. It's the best sound for calming the world down, but tonight, the calm stops at the window. We've got 12 new, first-hand accounts of dark entities, demonic possessions, and strange highway encounters that have broken people's rational minds, even in the quietest of places. Just take a deep breath, and let the sound of the rainfall lull you closer to the edges of the dark. Relax and fall asleep quickly to these true tales of terror. If you're new, a simple thumbs up or a subscription lets me know this scary sleep atmosphere is exactly what you're looking for. Thanks for that small courtesy. Easy to drift off while someone else lives the nightmare? Story 1. The rain sounds heavy here, a deep, thick curtain that muffles everything that isn't pressing against your own eardrums. I'm telling you this story because maybe, if you hear it under the right conditions, you'll feel the same sense of desperate isolation I felt every day for 8 years. This wasn't military service or some top-secret government research. It was just me, a forest ranger named Marcus, running surveillance for the U.S. Forest Service on one specific, 20-mile stretch of the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. Except the Forest Service wasn't the controlling entity here. It was a rotating mix of guys in black SUVs who called themselves the Crone Project, and they gave me my boundaries very clearly. The Crone Exclusion Zone, a perfectly square area the size of a small suburban town, was sealed off, legally, spiritually, and ecologically. My job was simple: keep locals out, retrieve government equipment that failed, and keep my mouth shut. The pay was good, and I needed an isolated life after my divorce. Everything was fine until the retrieval mission started. I had made my peace with the solitude of the Umpqua, the towering Douglas firs, and the constant wet decay underfoot. But the Crone Zone felt different even on the exterior. It was silent, I mean totally silent, even without the heavy rain muffling things. You could wait 10 minutes and not hear a single bird call or the rustle of a squirrel. My own truck's engine seemed to chew on the silence, a vulgar sound in a sacred place. The first official retrieval was a small, high-density drone. I got the coordinates, hiked in about a mile from the perimeter, and found it stuck, nose down, in the dirt, completely intact. Its log showed its battery died instantly, but every test I ran on the machine afterward returned negative. It was fine. That was the first hint. Later missions got stranger. We didn't lose drones. We lost small, automated surveying vehicles, four-wheeled platforms like little military tanks carrying radar equipment. They weren't crashing. Their internal logs showed their motion abruptly stopping for no physical reason. The second time, I had to hike 3 miles into the zone. The GPS coordinates led me to a stand of extremely thick, century-old trees that filtered out almost all the sunlight, making everything gloomier than a cellar. The surveying unit, Surveyor Zeta 5, was definitely off. It wasn't just stopped, it was tilted at a nonsensical angle. The 2 right wheels were digging into the dirt, but the 2 left wheels were elevated sharply, about 4 feet off the ground, resting only on air. I checked the ground around it. There was no physical structure, no root, no stone, nothing to support the elevation. It was just gravity giving up its hold on that side of the machine. The whole area around it smelled like nothing, no pine, no decay, no earth, just neutral emptiness. I radioed it into the Crone handler, an emotionless woman named Harper. I was told to restabilize the package for extraction. What I had to do was literally push the machine, physically, horizontally, to make the ground, or whatever force was at play, accept its weight again. It felt like moving an object magnetically repelled by the ground. When it finally thudded down, the silence slammed back in. I got out of there, feeling distinctly wrong, shaken not by fear, but by a physical violation of reality. Harper just logged it as stabilization protocol initiated and successful. Suspected localized gravity fluctuation anomaly. The biggest and most unnerving mission happened in my 3rd year with Crone. The assignment was a lost personnel retrieval. That kind of thing usually isn't my department. They use search and rescue operators for humans, no matter what they tell me about ecological duty. But this time, they insisted I was the only person close enough due to the weather. A researcher, Dr. Lena Cross, and her assistant had inexplicably walked right through the zone's outer motion sensors and vanished just inside the grid. Inside my pack, along with food and water for 48 hours, I carried 2 heavy, thick bundles of thick, specialized copper cabling that Harper called frequency attenuators. I was to unspool them and create a physical circle, 12 feet in diameter, where the researcher was expected to have stopped. I found the location easily at first. There was a small, military-issue backpack laid neatly on the moss, fully packed. No footprints in the mud around it, but there was Dr. Cross' high-tech satellite phone about 20 feet away. What the coordinates led me to wasn't her body. It was a spot in the forest where the reality of the forest warped, literally. In the same way the surveyor machine was tilted on air just a year ago, Surveyor Zeta 5, this location was impossible. At the center of the clearing, it wasn't a clearing at all, just a part of the forest with no underbrush, was a depression in the earth. The entire depression, shaped almost like an old Roman amphitheater, maybe 30 feet in diameter, acted as a mirror. But it wasn't water. Looking into it, I saw exactly what was surrounding me: the trees, the gray sky, my own face. But I saw it wrong. Everything was reversed, like a vertical cross-section of the Umpqua. What I knew to be trees were now a terrifying inverted lattice of soil and roots against what seemed like a black abyss beneath the trees themselves. It looked like the real world was stuck to a ceiling, floating over its dark twin. I stood there, paralyzed for over an hour, watching the anti-rain in the reflection. Eventually, the realization hit me. This anomaly wasn't just physical distortion, Harper always downplaying it too. Fluctuations. This was the zone attempting to invert everything, trying to pull the matter in this reality's reflection, where gravity and life were reversed. That's where Cross and her assistant had walked. They hadn't disappeared. They had been pulled into the reverse world. I snapped into action, remembering the rules I hadn't been actively taught, only suggested during the training. The perimeter protects against intrusion, not extrusion. I knelt down, trying to assemble the copper cable ring, the attenuator. I had it nearly closed when I looked up and saw the reflection was distorted. It was waving, violently, and inside, moving in the reflection's anti-world, were 2 extremely tall, skeletal shapes. It was Dr. Cross and her assistant. They were moving upside down, walking on the trees that served as the reverse world ceiling, their limbs long and contorted, their bodies moving like puppets whose strings had been cut and re-knotted. Their faces were pressed against their side of the forest, staring at me, and I knew they were in awful, constant, reversed pain. The worst was not their inverted movement, it was the sound. The reflection's surface started resonating with a thin, almost electronic wail that seemed wrong, impossible. And then I heard it, a sound that cut through the physical reality of the Umpqua, slipping right past the reflection. It was the assistant, her voice a terrible rasping sob, yet clearly pronouncing the reversal. Easy arpe, easy arpe, easy arpe. A praise spelled backward. Her message, whatever that word meant, was clear and terrifying. A strong, unseen repulsive force suddenly knocked the final ends of the copper attenuators apart. I lost my balance and fell back just as the entire mirrored depression began to ripple, and the copper cables started to rattle unnervingly. The electronic noise increased painfully. Remembering my training, I quickly and erratically, but successfully, secured and clamped the 2 ends of the cable together in the grass, shutting the circuit just 10 feet away from the perimeter of the anti-world. The moment this was completed, the whole mirrored depression returned to normal, appearing to be an unremarkable patch of moss again. No visual trace of Cross and her assistant, no inverted world. Harper just told me I acted successfully and that the attenuation event was logged. I didn't quit Crone after the gravitational anomaly. I didn't quit after the inverted life forms. But Cross' broken and reverse sob of easy arpe changed my entire perspective. I realized I was employed not to monitor the zone, but to perform damage control, to keep a dangerous mirror of the world from turning itself inside out or calling too loudly for me, who and where I am. To understand. I'm out of the Forest Service now, sitting here telling you this as the rain falls. Because I still hear the reverse sob when the drops hit the roof. Easy RP, easy RP, easy RP. I don't know what it means, but that sound lives in the dark, and I brought it out with me. I just hear it everywhere now, in the silence, in the roar, always in reverse. Story 2. If I asked you to picture an idyllic summer in rural Texas, you'd probably think of heat, cicadas, the smell of sun-baked earth, and lazy silence. That's exactly what I wanted. After my uncle passed, he left me his derelict 100-year-old family farm tucked away in Hays County. It wasn't picturesque, it was crumbling. The main farmhouse, a square cinder-block shell of a thing built sometime in the mid-40s, clearly needed a total gut job. I took early retirement and saw it as a spiritual clean slate, a chance to sweat out my corporate life and bring a piece of history back to life. I moved into a small, dry guest house while I worked on the main house. And you want to know what the first thing I noticed inside that old main structure was? It was the dust. Not just accumulated dust, but decades of deeply settled, thick, dry powder, as fine as flour, covering everything. That, and the strange, inexplicable sounds coming from the walls. The house was built with a low, shallow crawl space underneath, and no full basement. Inside, the walls were the most unnerving thing. They were thick plaster over ancient lath, and they breathed. Every time a large truck passed on the county road half a mile away, or even sometimes when the temperature dropped suddenly at night, you could hear the whole structure groan, settle, and strain. I just told myself it was old age, that I was hearing ghosts in the thermal expansion. But then the movement started. I was focused on the living room first, ripping up moldy, stained carpet. The days blurred into a cycle of demolition and heavy physical labor until full dark. One evening, around 1 a.m., sleeping soundly in the small guest house, I woke up with a sharp, cold jab of clarity across my bladder. I got up, crossed the dirt yard to the main house I was working on to use the portable toilet I'd set inside the front door. The power was off in the main house, but a full moon meant the gloom inside was still navigable. While standing there, relieving myself in the absolute silence, I heard it. A quiet, mechanical scraping sound, immediately above my head, the noise coming from the crawlspace access panel, which was located on the ceiling of the downstairs hall closet, above a ladder into the attic. Wait a minute. That panel accesses an attic. The crawlspace is under the house. The access panel couldn't be making the noise. The house was settling. So, I took a step away from the toilet and looked up. The moon was brilliant enough tonight to spill a pale shaft of light through the main front windows. I could see the ceiling clearly, and the panel was untouched. The scraping continued. Scrape. Tap. Scrape. It wasn't the slow, settling shudder of the house. This was active, purposeful movement. I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hatch. I just assumed it was. It was coming from inside the wall of the main hallway closet, precisely where the vertical wood studs would be. The sound had a pace to it, slow, careful, then a slightly faster, rhythmic scrape, like something was carefully, slowly shaving wood. My spine turned to ice. A rat? No living thing makes that repeated, methodical sound. It sounds like something cleaning its claws, grinding slowly to achieve a certain texture. My rational mind was screaming, "Rat! Raccoon! Squirrel!" But the sound in the silence was too intelligent, too present. I backed out of the closet slowly, breathing shallowly, and found a heavy hammer from my toolbox sitting nearby. Walking back very cautiously, I braced myself and shouted into the wall, just a single, harsh "Hey!" The scraping abruptly stopped. Total silence. After holding my breath for 10 unbearable minutes, I tentatively left, walking backward out the house, half expecting something to fall out of the closet ceiling onto my head. Nothing. The rest of the night I stayed awake, hammer next to my pillow, listening to the regular summer cicadas. After that night, I started working with a radio constantly on, anything to break the silence. For 2 weeks, the silence persisted, replaced only by music and talk radio. Then I found the holes. I had pulled down drywall in the main bedroom, a small, dark room near the back of the house. As I pulled away ancient insulation that was falling apart, the light on my mask revealed several holes carved cleanly into the lathe behind the insulation, right through the outer wall. They were small, no bigger than my thumb in diameter, and they were carved down the stud, one below the other, in a slightly irregular but definite vertical line. Maybe 6 of these small, smooth holes leading toward the floorboards. Almost like a set of peepholes. My blood ran so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. These holes faced not outside the house, which would have meant they were made by bugs, but inwards, pointed straight at the center of the room. Looking through one of them, the perspective distorted the light, but the purpose was clear. From the outside world, from somewhere between the 2 sets of block walls, something was perfectly placed to watch anyone standing, sitting, or sleeping in that small bedroom. Suddenly, the scraping noise returned in force. It wasn't above me, or in front of me. It was in the wall behind me now. I realized the thing had moved. It was tracking me around the demolition of the house. It knew where I was, or at least it could guess, based on the sounds of my work. The scraping was sharp this time, more frantic. I dropped the drywall hammer and scrambled out of that terrible room into the sunlight, my heart practically clawing its way up my throat. I left the building for the guest house, where I instantly called Harper, the local carpenter I'd hired for the final framing work a few weeks hence. I told him, "I've got a bad animal problem. You need to close off the crawl space and then seal the main walls, front to back, bottom to top." Harper showed up the next morning, shaking his head. "Mr. Thompson, crawl spaces ain't got no animals but the occasional possum. The roof is solid, the house has only 2 entry points, and they're open now, for your demolition work." As he explained the absurdity, he was walking the length of the external walls, looking into the low, dirty entry opening of the crawl space. "You sure you ain't hearing the beams?" That's when Harper paused, right next to the kitchen wall on the outside. He was looking at the small vent screen mesh. The screen was still intact, but the small wooden frame holding the screen was absolutely covered in a fine, blonde dust. He swiped it with his gloved finger and studied the dust on his hand. He then looked up, staring intently at the second-story exterior cinder blocks. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice flat with no Texas drawl left. "That dust, that ain't ordinary dirt dust. That's finely ground old limestone and mortar. And it's coming from inside these cinder blocks. The inside of this entire wall is empty between the blocks and the interior lathe. Whatever you got a hold of is not an animal that lives in the foundation. It lives inside the outer wall itself." He pointed to 2 small drill holes, hidden by old ivy, just under the kitchen window. "It made its own way in." Harper finished my job in 3 terrifying weeks. Every cavity, up to the attic, was cleared, sealed, filled with foam, and repapered. Throughout the whole ordeal, and without exaggeration, we both could hear the scraping. It followed our work, moving to the ceiling when we worked on the floor, and vice versa. It sounded distinctly like tools scraping stone, then wood, trying to dig around the layers we were adding. The volume increased steadily, becoming almost ear-splitting, before abruptly silencing the moment Harper completely sealed the last crawlspace air vent using mesh and metal rivets, a permanent seal. When he did that, the entire house made a large, almost desperate shudder, then settled with a final, heavy thud. Harper and I never spoke about the contents of the walls. We only discussed the successful removal of the dust problem. I've been living back in the main house and sleeping soundly now for a year and a half. Quiet, save the sounds of the rain. It's beautiful and perfectly silent. Except that I stopped using the hall closet as storage for my cleaning supplies. Its ceiling, the attic access panel, sometimes drips a perfect little puddle of white, gritty, gray dust. Just a tiny amount, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. And when there's a strong gust of wind against the outside of the old block walls, just very quietly, I hear a single, almost sorrowful tap, tap, tap from within the closet walls, a tiny, almost desperate final scratch from a creature now entirely entombed, knowing it only needs 1,000 more taps to break through. And I let it tap. Because I realized it's the house's neighbor, not mine. And as long as I don't disturb the structure anymore, the neighbor only taps. And I can sleep. Story 3. The coast of Maine in late fall is a special kind of cold. It's not a dry, crisp cold, it's a smothering, wet blanket of fog and freezing sea spray that clings to your sinuses and numbs your hands. This is the atmosphere I needed. I am not a ghost hunter, a cult investigator, or a thrill seeker. I was an architectural history graduate student needing data and an extraordinary thesis project. My subject documenting the degradation and restoration potential of historic, isolated maritime infrastructure, specifically the defunct Pemaquid Point Lighthouse. The old beacon was set on granite rocks overlooking an impossibly rough section of the coastline. It hadn't been in active use for nearly 80 years, replaced by automated systems, and it was in terrible shape. The windows were shattered from decades of relentless gales, the exterior stones were covered in barnacle-hard lichen, and the entire structure smelled intensely of sea salt, rust, and dampness. My assignment was intense. 3 consecutive nights alone inside the lighthouse, starting the second the sun went down, gathering light readings, structural acoustics, and taking hundreds of photographs to build a 3D model. The isolation was immense. The town was 5 miles down a treacherous road, and there was no cell service. The first night was just hard. Climbing the 148 rickety, iron spiral steps up to the watchroom felt like ascending a massive cast iron drill bit. The acoustics were the most unnerving part. Due to the high, circular stone structure, every little creak of the door, every shift of the wind, and every distant crash of the waves against the cliff face was funneled up through the center shaft and amplified into a resounding, echoing sound that made focus nearly impossible. I installed all my sensors, and when my work was done for the night, I settled into the dust-covered, windowless small office room on the second floor, wrapped in 2 emergency blankets and watching the digital feeds. Around 2 a.m., in the absolute windless lull, I heard the sound that confirmed the lighthouse wasn't just old, it was occupied. It was a slow, distinct, extremely rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the wind, metal, or water. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic rap sound, coming straight up from the ground floor's stone slab. It moved across the floor area, then stopped momentarily at the base of the massive staircase, and then began its agonizingly slow ascent up the interior column. I was wide awake, straining, listening as the sound moved from the first riser to the second. Rap, rap, rap. Slowly, step by step, an impossibly slow pace. Whoever or whatever was making that sound was carrying tremendous weight, or simply did not rush. It took what felt like 10 minutes for the sound to travel from the base to the 3rd floor, where my sensors confirmed the noise was now clearly adjacent to my temporary shelter. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight, ready to make a run for the outside. Then, the rhythm stopped just outside my 2nd floor office room. Everything went utterly silent, save for the eternal, washing sound of the distant tide. I listened for movement, breathing, anything rational. The only thing I heard was the sudden, sharp, heavy clang of a rusty door shutting fast, and then the slow, rhythmic tapping continued upward, up the steep, iron spiral stairs and away from me, passing right by my closed door without pause. Rap went up the stairs, continuing until it finally disappeared entirely into the dome of the watchroom above while I was cowering, heart pounding, too afraid to move. Was it a prank? Someone with specific access, using the long decay of the structure to scare me? But the clang was too definitive, too final, and the place was too remote to entertain mere mischief. I worked through the second night much faster despite the increasing apprehension, keeping the flashlight on and setting up tripods to capture any light anomalies in the stair center. That night, there was no slow tapping. Instead, the phenomena focused on the sound anomalies. My sound monitors, arrayed across the 3rd and 4th floors, recorded an increasing volume of deep, guttural coughs, wet, heavy coughs, as though someone was drowning or battling terminal pneumonia. It wasn't human. It was too sustained, too constant, and it didn't recede or become softer. The coughs didn't progress. They were a singular sound emanating from exactly one place, the tiny, disused bathroom nook attached to the top-floor living quarters, the room used decades ago by the resident lighthouse keeper. Finally, on the third and last night, when the light readings were meant to wrap the project, the manifestation became visual, direct, and overwhelming. The sounds, the tapping, the persistent hacking cough, had stopped entirely. The calm was worse than the activity. The atmosphere of absolute, dead stillness, broken only by the continuous ocean roar outside, felt like the holding of a breath. It was around 3:30 a.m. when my professional curiosity finally bested my survival instincts. I slowly climbed the stairs all the way to the watchroom dome to retrieve my remaining thermal camera. The dome room was surprisingly dry and dominated by the lens assembly, a massive, stationary glass structure that once held the Fresnel lens. I gathered my gear from the center of the room. When I turned back toward the stairs, I froze stiff. Standing directly in front of the lens assembly, staring fiercely out to the absolute blankness of the Atlantic, was the lighthouse keeper. He was a tall, thin man in a salt-stained, dark navy uniform. He wasn't transparent. He was solid and perfectly colored, appearing to just be silhouetted against the diffused, misty glass of the lantern room. But I knew he had none of the movement or breathing of a living man. His hand, covered in what looked like heavy burn scars and dirt, was resting precisely, possessively, on the brass railing. Fear rendered me speechless and motionless. I was trapped between him and the spiral staircase. He stood there, unmoving, for about 3 minutes, or what felt like 3 hours. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge me. He was completely focused on the sea. And then I saw the truth of him. The entire back panel of his coat, and the shoulder that faced me, was entirely coated in that fine, white, granular salt and lichen. This wasn't a man. This was the spirit of the structure, the living ghost of Pemaquid, covered in the calcified essence of the lighthouse itself. The rhythmic tap on the first night, that was his hand settling into routine, touching the rail. The coughs, that was the agonizing sound of the decaying stone over time, echoing in the tower. Suddenly he moved. Not with his body, but the hand on the railing smoothly slid down the structure just 6 inches, stopping precisely at a point below a brass plaque listing the names of keepers who had died on post. As he lowered his hand, he spoke. His voice was no more than a deep, wet-sounding whisper, yet it hit me with the force of a full-chested shout. "It's dark. It's too dark." And just like that, the vision snapped back. He didn't dematerialize or fade away like the romantic ghost stories suggest. The light around him changed. The shape of his form folded in on itself until there was nothing there but the empty railing and the dark sea. I scrambled down those iron stairs in a blind terror that transcended fear, breaking my flashlight in the process. I didn't stop until I reached the small dinghy boat on the stone shore, where I shoved my gear in and rowed away from the tower, not even caring that I was shattering valuable equipment. I never finished the thesis. I learned one thing about true hauntings. They only move when the light goes out. The keeper wasn't a man who died there. He was the vigil for the light, an anchor to a responsibility he never let go of, and who became the very walls of his home. And every night I hear the rain, I remember one thing, not how to fix the lighthouse, but that somewhere, in the dead heart of the cold winter sea, a salty, ghost-like and covered man is still standing, whispering in the dark, waiting for the lens to light up again. And he's still tapping. Story 4. The rain sounds in these newer Florida developments often amplify that strange hollowness of the houses. They are fast-built, drywall boxes, all stucco and cut-rate laminate, designed for quick comfort but strangely lacking in true privacy. This story happened 2 years ago, right after my wife, Sarah, and I moved our 2 small daughters, Lila, who was 2, and baby Maddie, just 4 months old, into a new subdivision outside Jacksonville. I work remotely, building software, and I'm very much a man of logic. Sarah is too. We trust what we can see, touch, and debug. The first time the house was silent at night, I literally thought, finally peace. But that peace was a very thin skin. We had just set up the nursery in the end room, a small, brightly painted rectangle decorated with teddy bears and suns. For Maddie, the baby, Sarah insisted on a high-tech baby monitor system with audio-visual recording and a very sensitive microphone. It was a comfort to us both in this new, unfamiliar place. Life revolved around Maddie's erratic sleep schedule, always broken by her small, insistent cries an average of 4 times a night. But one evening, around 3 a.m., the cry wasn't Maddie's. The monitor didn't sound a loud alarm. The noise was gentle. It was a soft, smooth singing. I listened closer. It was definitely a woman, humming a lullaby. It was deep, low, and beautifully melodic, too perfect for Sarah to be producing on demand in the middle of the night. It immediately set me on edge. Why would my wife be so softly serenading our younger daughter, and why hadn't she woken me up to check on the baby? So I rolled out of bed, grabbed the monitor receiver, and silently walked down the hall to the nursery. I cracked the door open and looked inside. Total, absolute silence. Maddie was sleeping soundly, perfectly still, breathing slow and deeply. Sarah wasn't in the room at all. In fact, her soft snore drifted out from the master bedroom right behind me. Yet, the monitor on my hand was still projecting the sound, a low, harmonic hum, rising and falling in hypnotic perfection, utterly distinct from the background sound of the rain outside. I flipped my attention to the visual feed on the monitor. The infrared feed showed Maddie in her crib. The mic, however, confirmed the sound was coming from the baby's crib area itself, only a foot away from the attached speaker. I didn't recognize the tune. It was an ancient, melancholic, 5-note progression with strange, unsettling intervals. I instantly realized my wife wasn't singing. I wasn't listening to Sarah. I was listening to something. My body was instantly wired with that flight or fight adrenaline surge. I rushed back to the monitor base, hitting the record button on the microphone input, capturing 5 crucial seconds of the humming before I cut the power to the camera and the monitor. I couldn't bear to hear it anymore. The next morning, I played back the recorded segment for Sarah. Her face went slack with fear. "That's not a person, David. It sounds like perfect pitch, but wrong." My 2-year-old, Lila, who was having breakfast, suddenly stopped chewing her cereal, tilted her head, and spoke to the empty sound. "Mr. Voice is hungry. I'm an engineer." I went straight for the debug. For 3 days, I searched the house. Radio frequency interference. A rogue signal from a neighbor. A toy hidden in the crib doing its job very badly. Nada. The sound only came at night, always around 3 a.m., always from inside the nursery, always a single, perfect lullaby, no background noise but the rain. I started to check sound processing software for abnormalities in the frequency band. On the 4th night, I recorded a full 30 seconds of the singing, and then I ran it back through a spectral analysis program. The results sickened me. My software displayed the acoustic wave of the lullaby on a chart. It was a mirror image. Each wave was reversed vertically and horizontally. The only way my software could generate that acoustic profile was if the sound had been physically sung, recorded, and then played in precise reverse. I looked at the chart for hours, feeling increasingly nauseated. The melody the thing was singing was not an original tune. It was Lila's lullaby, a custom lullaby my wife and I made up together, sung to Maddie as she slept, only it was being sung backwards. It was an auditory intrusion, a psychological manipulation. It mirrored our domestic routine and turned it inside out. Whatever it was, the inverted lullaby had heard our daily custom and reversed it, not just to scare us, but to reflect us. I realized it mirrored reality, and it now knew everything about us. That's why I named it the inverted lullaby. That night was the climax. I was asleep, but immediately jolted into awareness by the sound of Lila, my 2-year-old, screaming down the hall. Not just crying, terror. I grabbed the old wooden baseball bat from the hallway closet and ran. I was running to Maddie's room, but Lila's screams led me to the master bedroom. I threw open the door. Sarah was not there, but Lila was standing on the bed, screaming hysterically toward the closed wardrobe on the far side of the room. I dropped the bat and ran to her. "Lila! Lila! What is it? She was pointing at the closet door. The sound is too loud. I grabbed her small body and rushed out of the room. As I pulled the bedroom door shut, I finally heard it too, even without the monitor. It was the lullaby, but now amplified, loud, distorted, and moving. It wasn't the sweet harmony anymore. It was a demonic, broken choir screaming my daughter's special song in perfect reverse. The sound wasn't coming from Maddie's room. It was coming from inside my room, in the closet, a tight vertical space inside the wall where the clothes had been hanging. Whatever was in there had grown, multiplied, or simply was making its move. I slammed the door and locked it just as a single, incredibly powerful thump impact struck the door from the inside, and stopped. Silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was a mocking, calculating silence instead of the comforting, regular sound of our house. It was a silence that knew our names. Sarah, who was working late that night, returned 15 minutes later to find me sitting on the ground outside the bedroom door, Lila shaking silently in my arms, and a perfectly faint, fine dust of unidentifiable chalky soot around the closet door frame on the rug. We moved out 2 weeks later. The house sold fast. Who would suspect a sound anomaly? I left the high-tech monitor system behind. That lullaby, that single moment of reverse perfection, taught me that not all entities want to hurt you physically by throwing objects. Maybe they want to hurt you by knowing you, learning your tune, and inverting it. And every night the rain falls, and I hear Maddie's sweet snoring through our, much less sensitive, new monitor, I still strain my ear over the sound of the rainfall, listening for that 5-note melody, being sung in a beautiful, terrible reverse. I only have to hear it once to know that the new place, too, has been tuned into. And the inverted lullaby will start again. Story 5. The city night shift is mostly noise and light drowning out the silence. But every so often, you get a call that pulls you right out of the world you think you know and throws you straight against what shouldn't exist. I was part of a special details unit, what everyone else calls a SWAT team, but we mostly dealt with high-risk containment and retrieval. We were a dozen guys, highly trained, very cynical about everything, especially things that weren't backed by bullet impact data. My perspective changed drastically after Operation Silent Observer. We got the call from an unusually calm contact at the Major Crimes Unit, MCU, about 2 hours past midnight on a warm night. The location was an abandoned Jesuit retreat located on the periphery of the state forest, 45 miles north of Pittsburgh, an ancient, Gothic stone structure, 100 years old, surrounded by thick woods and a high wrought iron fence. It had been boarded up for 2 decades after a string of violent, mysterious deaths were officially logged as unexplained structural collapse. Unophically, the rumors concerned a failed exorcism and the disappearance of 2 priests. The MCU had called us because a local security unit had registered sustained, high-level noise disruption and unauthorized entry to the premises. Our mission, as stated by the brass: clear the premises, subdue any personnel present, and secure the facility without engaging if possible. We rode out in 2 armored vehicles under a heavy, starless sky. Even the drive to the facility felt wrong. The forest road was pitch black, and the massive stone building loomed out of the trees, a black monolith barely visible against the thick overcast. It looked less like a chapel and more like a tomb. As we moved in, there was the same heavy rain from earlier in the evening, now starting up again, muffling our approach but doing nothing to the atmosphere of dread. We breached the primary door of the chapel, which was standing wide open, its heavy wood splintered inward as if struck forcefully from the inside. Inside, the monastery was dark, cold, and quiet, save for the intense sound of the pounding rain hitting the massive stained glass windows, a percussive, deafening noise that reverberated through the vast space. The ground floor was eerily spotless. You could still see the high lacquer shine on the old marble tiles. We moved cautiously, flashlights dissecting the darkness. We found what interested the MCU in the central hall directly adjacent to the main altar. The entire 30-foot floor of the central hall was covered in a deep, burnt orange, powdery dust, like heavily oxidized ancient sand or fine brick aggregate. This powder was shaped by unseen forces into intricate, geometric patterns resembling complex, disturbing sigils and occult symbols, perfectly executed but unfamiliar. It didn't look drawn, it looked pressed into the dust. And in the very center of the largest circle, in stark white contrast to the orange, were piles of fine, pulverized white salt. It was a ritual space. Not just a chaotic entry, a methodical, very calculated ritual space. We continued our sweep of the building, moving down the long corridors flanked by arched columns, finding evidence of deeper-seated, methodical chaos. The walls were covered in deep, savage scratches that weren't simply carved in. They were carved out, as though large, curved talons had been pulled directly through the thick stone and plaster. My partner, Ray, a guy who routinely went up against armed militias without flinching, put his hand on one of the jagged rifts in the ancient wall. "It's like someone was trying to burrow in," he whispered, his voice muted by his helmet mic. Then, we rounded the corner, and the main manifestation began. We weren't in the structure's library. We were standing a foot away from a long, narrow table carved from what looked like black mahogany. The entire surface of the table, perfectly centered, was a puddle of pure, thick black sludge. It wasn't oil, paint, or water. It was an impossible, thick, glistening liquid that did not flow down the slant of the table but remained perfectly shaped, suspended in the center. Not dripping. The air around the puddle smelled intensely of ozone, sulfur, and unwashed metal. And from the very center of the surface of the blackness, a single sound emanated, a deep, rhythmic knocking. It was only 2 knocks, repeated over and over, knock knock. Knock knock. The sound wasn't loud, like the tapping in my colleague's house, but it was heavy, forceful, and profoundly unnatural. My lieutenant, Jackson, finally broke the professional silence on the radio. "Silent observer," he said, his voice flat with forced control. "We have an unidentified, fixed, auditory source bearing 003 relative to the central stairs." Proceeding further. It was the first time I saw one of my partners lose it. Ray stared at the black puddle from the distance. He raised his flashlight and pointed at it. "No," he said too loudly. "That thing is talking, not knocking. Don't go closer. That thing is testing the membrane." Jackson had to literally grab his vest and back him up. We didn't enter the room for a painful 5 minutes, listening only as the sound of the rain outside got heavier, the whole monastery shivering with the sheer downpour, and the steady, relentless knock-knock. We held a brief, whispered conference. The decision was made. We would secure the outer perimeter and lock off the section of the monastery we had breached, falling back on the non-engagement part of the mission. We started slowly backing up the hallway. We were 50 feet down the corridor when Ray stopped dead in his tracks. He wasn't staring at the black table. He was looking at the single, massive, wooden cross hanging suspended from the vaulted ceiling, fully 30 feet in front of the altar. The cross itself was covered in years of grime and dust, perfectly static. But as we watched, the cross began to swing, not a slow pendulum motion, but a violent, rapid, sharp swing from side to side, and the thick chains holding it emitted an agonizing shriek of tearing metal. The cross was moving so violently that its shadow, cast by our tactical lights, was a blur. Ray, my partner, raised his rifle to his shoulder and began firing. He was shooting at the cross's shadow on the wall. Not at the cross itself, but at the negative space around the projected shadow shape on the opposite stone column. He was screaming a single name. "Moloch! We see you!" I had to tackle him to the floor, knocking the high-powered rifle out of his hands, before he could do any more damage. We dragged Ray and extracted rapidly, securing the entire monastery and turning all of our internal logs and footage over to MCU and 2 very quiet priests who showed up in an unmarked car. Ray was discharged from the force the next day with a full medical deferral, citing an acute neurological event. But what I saw was not a neurological event. I saw the pure, concentrated, demonic manifestation known, at least by my partner, Moloch. The rain is falling tonight, just as hard as it was that evening 45 miles north of the city. I still work security, just not for SWAT. and when the downpour hits heavy, I can't shake the smell of ozone and sulfur from my memory. Years later, one detail remains etched into my mind. When Ray was being hauled through the central hall, his last lucid action was to quietly scrape up 3 tiny lines of the pulverized salt mixture from the ritual floor into the dust on the marble floor. At the time, I thought he was just adding another insult to injury for the demon. But now I know what he did. He carved one final, small, complex, protective seal into the floor, not to deter it, but to hold it there, trapped in that terrible isolation, forever knocking in the heart of the monastery. And tonight, I hope that ancient Jesuit stone is still holding. The thought of that blackness returning, capable of screaming your name in the dark, is far worse than any fear of the dark. Story 6. A long-haul trucker lives inside a perpetual night world. The hours between midnight and dawn, when the highways are empty, the rest stops are desolate, and the high desert air is absolutely freezing. I'm Dave, and for 15 years, I've been running the western route, hauling anything from military-grade hardware to produce from LA up towards Boise or Reno. You get used to the monotony. It's comforting. You learn to trust your eyes implicitly, because when you're driving a fully loaded 18-wheeler, 1 second of lapse can bury you or someone else. Out in the vast, empty state of Nevada, there's an almost perfect guarantee of solitude. And it was there that I had a definitive interaction with something that should not have been out there, especially late at night. I was crossing the state on a route called the Jimba Road, a shortcut that hooks off US 95, cuts through a long valley, and bypasses the congestion near the mountain passes. It's barely 2 lanes, and the nearest town is about 70 miles in either direction. Radio reception is non-existent, and my heavy-duty company's satellite link only transmits location data, nothing personal. Just total, silent, cold dark punctuated only by my headlights and the drumming of scattered rain that started early yesterday evening. This particular night, I was maybe an hour into Jimba at about 2:30 a.m. My head was clear, my coffee was black, and everything was routine. I was watching the darkness for deer, when my high beams picked up something moving in very quick, almost unnaturally smooth, broken rhythm near the roadside 50 yards ahead. I immediately slowed the rig and dropped my beams. It was a figure. A man, walking at a strange pace, very close to the asphalt edge. He was extremely tall, maybe 7 feet, and utterly thin, dressed in what looked like a loose, dark gray jumpsuit that blended perfectly with the shadow of scattered juniper bushes around him. His hair looked long and wet. I immediately felt the pull of basic human decency. No one walks Jimba Road. The terrain is all gravel and saltbush, the wind is freezing, and there's nowhere to go. I slowed down completely, pulling the huge truck as far over to the shoulder as the load would permit, rolling my window down, ignoring the cold. "Need a ride, buddy? Next exit's 40 miles out. You'll freeze to death out here," I yelled gently over the heavy sound of the diesel engine. The figure stopped walking. It didn't turn its body, but its head rotated slowly. Slowly, slowly, from facing the destination ahead to facing me, and kept turning, past the limits of what a human neck should be able to do, until it was facing directly behind it, completely twisted out of place. The action alone was mechanical, deeply uncomfortable. Then, finally, it rotated back toward me just enough for me to see its full silhouette in the headlights. I saw the face long enough for my brain to process one final truth about the encounter, which sent all my blood pressure to my heels. Its face, from what I could see under the low light, was not disfigured or rotting. It was inverted. Where eyes should have been were 2 deep, high cheekbones. Where the upper lip should have started near the nose, I saw the thick ridge of the forehead. Its mouth and chin seemed to be positioned up near where the natural eye sockets should have been, almost looking like a badly assembled porcelain doll. It had a pair of gleaming, massive eyes, but they were located just under its chin line, staring backward into its own neck, and they were reflecting the rain-covered lens of the headlights back at me like 2 shining, horizontal slits of a cat. The creature's reversed head remained still, facing me, but it was now emitting a high-pitched, thin sound, almost like a dog being quietly, consistently suffocated. I didn't need any more information. This thing wasn't injured, tired, or human. A surge of paralyzing, pure revulsion, not just fear, sent my hand reaching for the window crank. In that single instant I reached for the controls and the creature saw my movement from its inverted eyes. It shifted. It didn't run, jump, or move its feet. It simply rotated its entire body on the spot, turning what looked like one vertical axis against gravity, making a disgusting crick sound, and then began taking incredibly fast, vertical loping strides towards my parked rig. It launched itself forward not by running, but by lifting its right leg high, dragging its left leg forward while swinging its freakishly long arms like unbalanced clock hands, its reversed head remaining centered toward the truck. It was moving too fast, too deliberately, and certainly coming for me. My training and survival instincts took over with brute force. I slammed the shifter into the lowest gear, and with a roaring, bellowing cloud of diesel exhaust that swallowed the figure in a toxic plume, I completely ignored the empty road and floored the big machine for the shoulder, driving violently through the scrub and across the hard, saltbush earth. I pushed the entire rig to near tipping speed, taking it off-road to avoid any chance that the terrifying figure could grab onto the cabin door. I heard the grinding of gravel and some distant, tearing sound that might have been the truck's fender catching a bush, or worse. I didn't stop that violent run through the desolate earth, the rain drumming furiously on the windshield, until I was nearly 5 miles away and back onto the main Jimba asphalt strip. I then pulled the truck over, gasping for breath, grabbing the satellite phone to call the authorities. But with the high wind and the pouring rain, I thought better of it. What would I tell them? A 7-foot-tall, inverted-headed man tried to hitchhike with me. He walked like a terrified deer without knees. I wouldn't hear the end of it, or worse, I'd be pulled into a federal incident like the one in Operation Silent Observer that Ray had told me years ago in his short-term release after his terrifying episode. The only physical proof I had were 3 long, deep scratches along the center of the passenger side door of the truck cabin. Deep, savage marks that hadn't been there before, perfectly horizontal, too high for a normal animal, and too deep for a standard brush strike. I reported it as vandalism at the next way station I entered. I still drive the Jimba Road. The company pays too well, and it cuts too many hours, so I have to keep running it. But I don't drive there past 1 a.m., and I absolutely refuse to stop for any kind of distress on the side of the road on that strip. The memory of that perfectly twisted head and those massive, staring eyes under the chin, moving with an impossible mechanical gait through the dark. That thing was a physical insult to the law of nature, and my mistake was simply being there when the other side decided to take a stroll. After that night, the rain on the windshield sometimes looks just like the reflection of those great, unnatural eyes. And I accelerate a little faster, convinced that the figure might still be out there, finally reaching the end of Jimba, waiting for a lift. Story 7. They say every old house has too many stories, especially around here in New England where structure and stone seem to absorb history. Our house was a sprawling, gray stone Victorian, built in 1888. It sat on an extremely marshy, tree-crammed piece of land outside a quiet Connecticut town. My wife, Jessica, and I bought it 5 years ago, fully aware of its eccentricities, the drafty chimneys, the bizarre layout, the intense, unrelenting smell of damp earth, and something organic that lingered everywhere. But we were young, idealistic, and loved the challenge of restoration. Everything was old, rotting, and falling apart in an expected, romantic way. Until the house started defending itself against my attempts to heal it. The very first problem was the rot. I am not talking about normal, wood-boring beetle or termite decay. I am talking about concentrated, hyper-specific rot that targeted only the new materials I brought in. For the kitchen alone, I replaced the window frames, brand new, treated pine, twice in 2 years. Both times, Jessica and I would come back from a weekend trip to find the wood dark, spongy, and structurally compromised, smelling strongly of ammonia and putrefaction. The original, 1888 window frames next to them, however, remained absolutely solid and impervious to decay. It was systemic. The house preferred its own materials, and it aggressively rejected mine. We soon learned that the house had a rhythm, an almost biological cycle. It was the breathing. On days when the deep, heavy fog rolled in from the nearby marsh, the whole house would make a sound, a low, resonant hum. It wasn't the wind or the pipes. It felt like compressed air being very slowly, minutely, squeezed out of the ancient stone foundation. The sound would start soft underfoot, a low mmHmm, and would continue, pulsing, for hours. It was a sound so low that you could feel it not through your ears, but through your sternum. On those peak, breathing days, my 10-year-old son, Tim, would complain silently about the air, running to open every window, regardless of the chilling winter temperature, saying, "It can't breathe, Dad. It needs to stop sucking in." His comment terrified me, not only because he sensed the sound, but because he correctly phrased the sound as sucking in. The house wasn't expelling air, it was inhaling. After he said that, I put acoustic sensors in the walls and floorboards. During one heavy fog afternoons, breathing, one set of sensors right at the foundation line registered a low-frequency pulse, a biological wave that seemed to expand and contract roughly once every 4.3 seconds. We were sharing our home with a geological phenomenon, or worse, a sentient, living entity. The house was breathing. The realization culminated in the worst incident, the odor event. The small basement, the house's absolute core, had only one door, leading to a long, winding stone tunnel that they called the root cellar. I kept that door permanently sealed with a heavy-gauge piece of lumber and a strong padlock. I never liked the smell from down there. It was pungent, sweet, sick decay, and highly concentrated. One Saturday, as Jessica and I were working the garden during a light rain shower, my daughter, Leah, who had been upstairs in our attic sewing room, came down the stairs, quietly sobbing and pressing her face to my side. "Daddy," she whimpered, her voice shaking. "The house wants my thread." In her hand was a spool of my wife's bright, vibrant scarlet embroidery thread, pulled and knotted violently into a massive, wet tangle. The scent hanging on it was so intense, so overpowering that I felt instantly dizzy. It wasn't the musty cellar odor. It was the smell of decomposition, sulfur, and concentrated old blood. I immediately checked the cellar door. The huge padlock was untouched. The lumber was still firmly screwed in place over the stone archway. Nothing had gotten out, unless nothing needed to. The thread must have been an offering, or a retrieval, done by a very fast and small agent of the house. The full shock hit 10 minutes later, when Tim, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, pointed his finger to the seam right under the locked root cellar door, and then back at the crimson thread. "It came from there. It wants red stuff, Dad." The odor was suddenly intensifying in the kitchen, becoming almost unbearable, seeming to be concentrated around the air vents. We found the source of the intensifying smell in the walls along the corridor. Thin, thick, sweet-smelling red blood was weeping slowly from the unvarnished wood panels of the dining room archway, beating and flowing out of them, like the house was spontaneously lacerating itself. Running in blind panic, I grabbed the heavy crowbar and started prying the planks off the old wall near the most concentrated source of the blood. The smell of ammonia exploded in a cloud that almost knocked me out. Behind the wood, under the plaster, running along the insulation just visible in the gloom of the cavity, was something that was definitely not wood or stone. It was a massive network of thick, damp, fibrous vines with bright red, wet nodules. It looked exactly like a vascular system, full of capillary roots and dense, pulsating tissue. The entire inner structure of the house, along the entire left wall, was covered in a deep red, wet biological mass that pulsed visibly in time with the low, grinding mmHmm of the house's breathing. This wasn't an infestation of mold or algae. This was the house's life organ. I sealed the hole immediately with a cheap polymer foam I had on a shelf, not caring about the restoration aesthetic anymore. I told the landlord that there was a massive water pipe burst and rot problem, that the original contractor must have used living vegetation as a supporting timber beam, some absurd lie about old-time shipbuilding methods. I don't talk about the vascular, pulsing core to anyone except Jessica and now to you. We still live here. We still attempt minor repairs. But we no longer try to fix anything structural. We now know that our house, standing tall and lonely in the marsh with the rain outside, is not just a building, it is an incredibly complex, slow-moving biological organism, a stone tumor over a living foundation. It still breathes. Whenever the fog rolls in thick, and the rain masks the low hum, I run to the children's room, not to check on them, but to close their windows tightly. Because if the house is a living, breathing entity, then the ghosts we sometimes hear scratching at the roof are probably the equivalent of our fingernails. And the house is hungry for new material to fight the decay of its own precious organs. We are the caretakers of a magnificent and terrifying beast, and its heart is red, fleshy, and demands solitude for its breathing. And as long as they are quiet, and not pulling at the red thread again, we're mostly safe here in the chronics of the house that breathes. Story 8. Chicago nights are all granite, glass, and wind, a sharp, cutting environment. I was the night supervisor for security at the Axis building, a 90-story corporate monolith whose top 30 floors were still completely unfinished, concrete shells waiting for tenant money. My job was routine: patrol, monitor CCTVs, manage 2 lower-level guards, and supervise the fire panel tests. It was almost offensively boring work for 3 years straight, which made it the perfect gig for me. My domain started on the 11th floor, the last level open to tenants, up to the top floor where the antenna spire pierced the clouds. The 12th floor became my prison. The 11th floor was operational. The 13th through the top were shells, cold, dark, and utterly inanimate concrete and exposed pipes. The 12th floor, however, was in a strange intermediate state. Built out with rough partitions, a few ceiling grids, but mostly left dark, quiet, and absolutely empty due to a long-running, messy legal dispute between the developer and a primary tenant who backed out. For 18 months, nothing was allowed to happen up there. My specific instruction was to log and verify nothing was ever moved on the 12th floor. Not even small items. My patrol shifted to the higher floors exactly at 2 a.m. It was always cold on 12 when I stepped off the service elevator, even in August. But the first anomaly wasn't a visual disruption, it was the smell. The entire floor always carried a scent of bitter, dry rust and static electricity, like touching an old car battery on a damp day. That smell was accompanied by a subtle, deep humming in the concrete slab itself, a resonant vibration that made the soles of my shoes buzz. I always assumed it was induction heating for the unfinished HVAC conduits. The sound changed after about a month. The hum never went away, but during my 2 a.m. walkthrough, I would hear small, distinct, acoustic additions to the environment. The 12th floor developed an unnerving soundtrack of tiny, random plinks, scratches, and the almost imperceptible sliding of imaginary items across the gray concrete. It sounded like an absent child was quietly pushing tiny metal cars in the extreme, dead silence. These plinks were always separated by massive stretches of silence. Too random for natural settling, but not quite terrifying. Yet, the incidents accelerated after the 5th month, what I call the escalation. The sounds became concentrated. Instead of ambient random chaos, the noises were restricted to a single bank of exposed pipes near the building's central core. I would step off the elevator, and the entire section would instantly start sounding like a bad plumber's nightmare. A rhythmic, sharp bang, clank, bang, stop. I'd check the sensors, and the temperature gauge on the surrounding pipes would sometimes jump by 30 degrees Fahrenheit instantly, then stabilize. Impossible for a static, unused pipe system. I started a specific investigation. I set up a single, high-definition infrared camera on a tripod near the elevator bank, specifically directed at the section of noisy pipe. I told my supervisor the reason was intermittent pressure fluctuations. On the second night, my thermal camera recorded something I couldn't explain. The pipes themselves remained visually untouched, but the heat maps showed that where the banging noise emanated from, the ambient air temperature would be instantaneously replaced by a human-sized thermal signature, a shape strongly suggesting a man's torso and outstretched arms, a sudden burst of high, sustained heat, and then the heat vanished immediately after 3 massive bangs shook the entire steel structure of the elevator core. Whatever it was, it had a thermal footprint consistent with a living person, and it was violently interacting with the core structures through extreme bursts of latent heat, possibly with the strength of a fully loaded sledgehammer swung hard. The final escalation, the thing that ended my 3 years of quiet patrol, happened during a rare, severe thunderstorm that hit downtown Chicago, making every sheet of glass a drum for the torrent outside. The rain and wind were absolutely deafening. I remember stepping off the elevator at 12, which was already buzzing and hissing much louder than usual from the induction heat hum, and finding the environment physically unstable. The air conditioning vents above the elevator banks had been ripped violently away from their mountings, bent out of shape, and one very large one, some 20 pounds of thick galvanized steel, had been thrown 60 feet down the hallway like a light kite, landing with a terrifying screech and thud against the concrete partition. This was not a temperature fluctuation. This was severe, life-threatening physical impact. And then I saw the first visual confirmation of the resident. Past the overturned chairs and the air vents, in the gloom of the back quadrant of the empty floor, I saw a shape. It was a man, short, wide, and hunched over low to the ground, surrounded by a faint, static blue glow that pulsed visibly along his back and shoulder. His arms were raised in front of him, and I heard the sound I now recognized, the metallic, scraping sound of heavy rust being ground off iron. He was moving his arms across one of the temporary chipboard partitions installed for office spacing, and the thing was not scratching the wood. It was performing an invisible act of violence. The wood would suddenly snap inward with a violent thwack, as if delivered a powerful, clean blow by a hammer from the empty air, and a small puff of the dry, white, pulverized gypsum dust that coated the floor would lift up to envelop the hunched phantom within its swirling fog. I immediately called security for a team sweep for vagrant disturbance, and locked off the entire level, retreating silently to the safety elevator lobby on the ground floor. As the heavy doors of the main lift rumbled shut on 12, the hum of the building's power system changed forever for me. As I descended, the hum was accompanied, for the final minute of the extremely slow ride, by a chorus of tiny, mocking, extremely fast plink-plink-plinks running down the cable line of the elevator shaft as if following me. I resigned a week after the incident with stress and fatigue. I never told the team what I saw, the small, powerful man in the static blue glow, destroying the unfinished room one thwack at a time. The 12th floor was waiting for someone to build it out, to make it a livable space. And what I realized is that the poltergeist loved the potential of the floor, and it was actively destroying every attempt to colonize it, defending its desolate, rusted, perfect loneliness. And now, when I hear the rain hitting concrete outside my apartment, I still hear the low, static hum of the steel. Occasionally, the faint, unnerving plink of something light sliding across an unseen floor. Not from outside an air vent or through the wall. It seems to come straight from the concrete slab of my own apartment building, having somehow latched onto my routine. And I just know that the Axis building poltergeist, having successfully defended its empty 12 floors, has probably decided that my quiet apartment makes for a lovely, long-term, new empty canvas to practice its slow, methodical, destructive craft. And it's only just begun its slow, deliberate escalation against me, one little plink at a time. Story 9. I've spent the bulk of my career submerged in sound. I'm a forensic audio engineer. My job is to take imperfect, degraded, or compromised audio recordings, everything from court depositions to old archival records, and clarify them. Noise reduction, frequency restoration, and often, verifying that the sound represents the original truth of the moment. My studio is my church, perfectly soundproofed, acoustically tiled, and cut off from the noise of the outside world, including the sounds of the rain that always beat on the roof above me. Everything is clinical, controlled, and verifiable. Until I worked on the O'Malley archives. 3 years ago, I was hired to clean up the private historical collection of the late Senator Joseph O'Malley. He had accumulated priceless interviews with World War II veterans for his never-completed war history project. The files I was working with were extremely old, low-resolution phonograph records that had been digitized 20 years ago onto fragile magnetic tape. My project focused on the last living witness, a private first class named Silas, who served in the final Italian campaign. PTV Silas's voice was shaky, his audio quality low, marked by a constant, low-frequency flutter. I started processing the main interview segment, which featured Private Silas recounting a terrifying 30-hour standoff with Italian fascist black shirt units in an abandoned stone cottage near Florence. I was focused on removing the deep hums and physical background noise when I first noticed the small interruptions in his speech. While Silas spoke a sentence in his trembling, clear Iowa English, "We found a small opening, and we took a look inside to see who was there." There would be minuscule, split-second audio drops, almost like very bad tape splices or digital hiccups. These weren't gaps in the recording, they were incredibly short, precisely timed intrusions of another sound, always occurring between Silas's distinct word phonemes. So it would be, "We found, click, a small, hiss, opening and we took, snare, a look inside to see who was, grunt there." They were too subtle to be actively heard in real time, only visible on the high-resolution spectral graph as tiny anomalies. Intrigued, I used high-grade software to isolate these micro-interruptions and amplify them against the background. To my shock and fear, the separate anomaly sounds were not noise or static. They formed fragments of vocalization. Each tiny hiccup was a syllable of another voice, deep, resonant, and absolutely foreign to every established language I knew of. It was deep in the bass range, almost subsonic, and it seemed to growl the syllables in a rapid, complex stream. I realized what I had, a covert voice recording, perfectly sandwiched between the vowel and consonant sounds of Private Silas's human narration. Someone, or something, was talking through the old man's story. What escalated the issue wasn't the voice itself but the speed, volume, and rhythm. The unknown voice had a terrifying, methodical pulse. When I played the full track, slowing the speed down to 10% of real time to properly isolate the syllables, I was met with what could only be described as a rapid-fire dialect of complex, repetitive, archaic-sounding Latin or another forgotten Romance language. Slowed down, the single syllables that had appeared as clicks and hisses now formed full, clearly enunciated words. I spent another week consulting with 5 language historians, forensic linguists, and even a Vatican historian working on obscure biblical translations. None of them could conclusively identify the phrases, only vaguely identifying commonality with ancient, pre-Christian, Mediterranean dialects, languages that would have been dead 2,000 years before Silas's interview. I learned one thing about the mysterious insertion: it was hostile. While I played the raw, isolated voice in my studio environment, the air pressure inside felt wrong. The bass range was so low that it physically radiated through my body, causing light, internal pressure nausea. The voice was, structurally, physically, aggressively trying to insert itself into the human story. I was afraid to process much more raw audio. So I used the software to translate the structure of the syllables into a visual frequency graph, a spectrogram, to see the shape of the sound. And that's when it hit me. The pattern of the spectral image, the visual representation of every sound, every syllable, was comprised only of straight lines, a highly regular, rigid sequence of angles and high-frequency peaks that resembled not natural speech, but a complex piece of computer code or geometry. It was like the creature behind the voice couldn't curve its speech to make natural human sounds, so it was forced to deliver its speech in a sharp, hard binary, like pure alien code transmitted through the human voice box. My greatest fear was of its objective. The mystery voice seemed to be repeating one set of phrases constantly. My linguistic consultant said, "I have no idea what the dialect is, but structurally it's a list. It's a very specific technical list." When I finally layered the code sequence on the full 30-hour log, the truth was horrifyingly clear. The alien voice was repeating a list of every name, date of birth, and military service number of every soldier PFC Silas had ever mentioned by name in his entire 30-hour recording. Not only the Americans, but also the Italian soldiers and those of the opposing German division he mentioned, including their exact burial plot coordinates. The mic had captured a surveillance file, a precise ledger of every person who had participated in that 1944 event. Even the location. The cottage in Florence. I ran that phrase through the code sequence, and the output provided were 3 sets of GPS coordinates directly corresponding to the cottage and 2 other houses Silas entered. The mystery voice was a recording machine masquerading as a dialogue. I had found an artifact embedded in the tape that was not a ghost or a poltergeist, but a deep, dark passive collector. I finally removed all the sound aberrations from the 3-decade-old tape. I successfully clarified Private Silas's final story without the background code on the recording. I was paid and the archive was delivered, but I keep a small 5-second sample of the original, compromised audio on an air-gapped drive in my personal desk. I sometimes play the isolated, slowed-down code and listen to the silent, geometric list of names being read off the scroll. The ancient code's geometric sound in the memory of the freezing, unnatural atmosphere it emanated from always remind me of the cold, digital truth. Our human conflicts, tragedies, homes, and battles are not just isolated events. They are all being monitored, recorded, archived, and listened to by something with a rigid, unnatural, technological command of language, a creature that speaks in code. And now, simply by cleaning up that tape, I have a copy of the list. And I know I am on it. And with every sound of the rain against the window, I can do nothing but hear the sharp, geometric clicks of the code inserting itself into the empty space of my silence. Story 10. Not every terrifying encounter in this world involves specters or unexplained gravitational forces. Some are born from a terrible, ancient will, a true, sentient malignancy. My name is Elijah, and I was raised in the low country of South Carolina, an environment saturated with superstitions, gullah tales, and deeply conservative Christian principles. My specific passion, or I guess obsession, centers on the study of archaic religious combat, ancient methods of exorcism lost to modern psychiatry. Most people use my profession only as sensational material for their podcasts or videos, but I sought out the genuine article. A few years ago, I got exactly what I was looking for. I received a strange, handwritten, nearly illegible letter containing a single paragraph request for help. The location was 4 days away in a remote swamp community near Bluffton, South Carolina. The home was ancient, wood frame, set 100 yards back from a marshy inlet, and surrounded by a towering wall of overgrown oak trees covered in Spanish moss. It had no electricity, no running water, and gave off an oppressive, palpable sense of decay and rot. I didn't meet the sender. The only occupant was a single, severely debilitated man, thin and profoundly weak, lying on a dust-covered cot in the center of the main house with a small, sputtering paraffin lamp at his side. The sender's distant relative who had succumbed to a severe case of what he claimed was internal demonic possession. He wasn't violent, ranting, or exhibiting superhuman strength like the movies depict. He simply lay there, staring listlessly at the moisture-stained ceiling, repeating the same word, over and over, at random intervals. Ablution. 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 It sounded like a whispered instruction. The house smelled faintly, continuously, of wet ashes and stale metal. The only sound was the distant whine of insects, and throughout the night, the steady, rhythmic drip 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 of the humid air condensing into water on the bare metal frames of the windows that had long lost their glass. A perfect background for a quiet madness. I spent 2 days documenting the case. The man, whom I'll call John, rarely moved. His eyes seemed fixated on a black, fist-sized stain on the ceiling, a spot of mold or dark moisture damage directly over the cot. He only ate sparingly and drank no water, only strong, clear liquor delivered by a very nervous local cousin who feared going near the house. It was a classic, waiting to feed the devil scenario. On the third night, a night marked by a relentless, heavy, soaking rain that sounded like a washing machine tumbling stones and soil, John's calm broke. I was sitting cross-legged about 8 feet from him, cataloging my ritual implements. The light from the single candle did little against the absolute blackness of the house. John sat straight up in the bed, a sudden, impossible jolt of spinal power for a man so debilitated. His eyes, still staring at the black ceiling spot, were not John's eyes anymore. They were a sharp, shocking electric blue that seemed to absorb my candle's meek light. His lips did not move, but the voice that emerged was a low, sibilant hiss, amplified unnaturally in the small room. "Silence, observer." That single, controlled, authoritative statement froze me in my place. But what came next was more unsettling. The entity, the demon occupying John, was speaking in a perfect, flawless counter to my research notes, repeating to me a passage from a forgotten 14th century Jesuit manual on ritual excision, a text I'd only read a photocopy of that morning. It was an intellectual, not a theatrical, possession. It knew my methods. I knew a full, theatrical exorcism was not an option here. The entity was too clever, integrated, and aware of Christian counter-rituals. Recalling my most archaic and elemental research, I knew I needed to use an anchor to halt the intelligence. I carried one object into the dark house besides my small bag of ancient notes, a single, 25-pound, solid burlap sack of unpurified sea salt obtained from a salt merchant on the coast. Sea salt, particularly unpurified salt derived from seawater, possesses ancient apotropaic properties beyond the known Christian ritual. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I ignored the hissing that followed and rapidly started my main attempt at isolation. I drew a small, basic cross on the dirt floor around John's cot, using my last few drops of holy water mixed with mud, and then I opened the salt bag. The sheer blinding white of the raw salt against the gloom was shocking, a small spotlight in the darkness as the grain cascaded out. The mere sound of the salt hitting the ancient floor elicited an intense, visceral response from the occupant. The demonic intelligence screamed, a sharp, sudden cacophony of 24 different voices at different pitches and speeds, all emanating simultaneously from John's motionless body. The sound alone was paralyzing, forcing me to cover my ears, utterly destroying the quiet sound of the rain outside. I continued, pouring a final defensive circle around the cot, creating the seal of salt. The moment the physical circle was closed, the terrifying sound broke clean inside the house, and the intelligence was utterly trapped. John immediately sagged against the cot, a deeply exhausted, frail human, having no recollection of his dramatic display. He muttered the word quietly again. Ablution. I knew the entity was still with him, but now it was contained, locked within the boundary. I spent the next 2 days sleeping outside in my SUV, just outside the radius of the salt, listening to the relentless rain. Knowing that the seal needed to be perfect, I went inside once every 12 hours to re-pour a fresh layer of salt around the exterior of the room itself, creating a second protective perimeter for my own safety. The hissing was constant but weak now, contained. Then, during one final check right before leaving, I saw the impossible. The black spot on the ceiling that John had been staring at had been changing subtly. Over a 50-hour period, during the entity's containment, it had begun to expand in area. Its moisture, I realized, was not condensation. It was slowly, steadily drawing moisture up from the ground underneath the house, from the water table and the marsh itself, drawing its own black and wet self out of the earth towards the entity's containment sphere, trying to breach containment, not by fire or power, but by basic moisture capillary pressure. It was working to weaken the salt seal. I left the salt there, 30 more pounds of it piled up inside and outside the room. I contacted the relative who had written the letter, not for an exorcism, but for a constant supply of salt. I realized the purpose of John's muttered word, ablution. He was giving the command for purification, a purification the demon actively wanted to stop. I still hear the constant, quiet, steady drumming of the rain. And when I close my eyes, I see that spot on the ceiling, expanding slowly outward. Because I know that entity is still there, trapped just within the seal. It's a demon whose attack is not strength or fire, but slow, inevitable corrosion by moisture, patiently waiting for the salt to dissolve within the humidity and the endless drizzle of the South Carolina lowcountry. And as long as the people remember to salt that room, it will remain there, slowly, endlessly waiting for the seal of salt to break. Story 11. The absolute quiet is the greatest part of owning an old, 2-story home built in 1950s suburbia. especially when the insulation is good and the heavy-duty summer rain is muted down to a comfortable, steady drone on the asphalt shingles. I work from home now, and I value that silence. Last winter, the only quiet part of the house I'd never fully bothered with was the large attic, a space about 20 feet by 30, shallow, dusty, and primarily containing the forgotten junk of 50 years of slow American entropy. I only went up there because my HVAC unit fan started screaming. I navigated the insulation to the unit, fixed the fan relatively quickly, and then started looking through the mounds of damp, mildew boxes, seeing what I could clear out. Under a collapsed cardboard box full of early 90s Christmas ornaments, I found it, an ancient, massive, brick-ugly Motorola flip phone. It was remarkably clean considering the grime of the room. I immediately pocketed it, assuming one of the previous owners had simply abandoned it due to the age and lack of use. Back downstairs in the warm glow of my living room, I plugged the thing into a generic charger. After fully 30 minutes, the battery lit up, displaying the date, 11/22/2004. The phone was entirely wiped, no contacts, no messages. But its internal memory was massive for its time, and the previous owner had used it primarily as storage. Specifically, a large subfolder in the camera roll labeled "Selfie, do not send" contained almost 150 unique photos. My professional curiosity as a former IT analyst kicked in. Who takes 150 selfies in 2004 and labels them like that? The anxiety of what I was seeing started almost instantly as I clicked through the grainy, low-res images. Every single photo was a classic 2004-era selfie, taken upward from a high angle into a badly lit room by the holder of the phone, and every photo focused on a single face, mine. It showed me, sleeping. The clarity of the shots proved 2 points immediately. 1, it was me, 5 years ago, when I first moved into the house. And 2, the face taking the photo, the subtle angle on the phone holder, the distance to my own face, the backdrop of old blankets, and the specific color of the old bedroom walls, meant the phone-wielding figure was standing within 2 feet of my sleeping body. Over the next half hour, my own blood pressure spiked as I scroll-reviewed photos spanning 2 full years of my initial occupancy of the house. Every single photo was of me, sleeping. The perspective always varied, sometimes from the side of the bed, sometimes from a few feet above the duvet, just the top of my head and my shoulder, and increasingly uncomfortably, some seemed to have been taken almost directly at my pillow, focusing only on my left eye just hours after I would crash out. Every single photo was taken in the same absolute, starless pitch black of night, the only visible illumination coming from the glowing screen and the camera's minimal flash. The unseen photographer was meticulous and persistent. The fear reached true, crippling horror only when I noticed the common element in the background of about 40 of the most recent photos. The old bedroom's furniture was gone now, replaced with my wife's, which we only acquired 3 years ago. Yet the figure taking the photo remained. And if I zoomed close to the left side of the frame in the 40 newest photos, just beyond the outline of my sleeping body, always in the same place, standing perfectly still, I could make out a slight visual distortion in the air. A barely visible shadow, too solid to be just a smudge on the old image sensor, standing straight up in full view, close enough to be in the same shot as me. It was the photographer. The person who kept taking my sleeping selfies for 2 whole years. The realization forced the obvious and terrifying calculation, the timeline. The latest pictures in the subfolder were taken 3 years ago, just before I met my wife. The photographer was active during the coldest time of the year. My air conditioner unit fan was on the blink. I had just found the phone on the attic floor. It had been asleep for 3 years. I was shaking violently, clutching the heavy phone in my hand, as the outside rain picked up and became an aggressive drumming sound outside my window. I knew then that the simple act of charging and lighting up the abandoned device had, effectively, awakened him. He hadn't been defeated. He had simply been silenced by technology until he was needed again. The photographer was a digital entity, tethered to the power of the phone, a specter that didn't walk the hall but followed its power source. I didn't destroy the phone. My rationale returned to that engineer's logic I once had. I took the phone, wrapped it carefully in 2 thick plastic construction bags filled with salt and water, hoping the elemental materials would suffice against the electric current of the entity, and I locked it in the trunk of my car, sealed on a remote airfield lot under heavy CCTV coverage. I drove the car across state lines, leaving it in an enclosed lockbox. I never checked the trunk again. But I still sleep in that same bedroom. And when I close my eyes and the sound of the rain lulls me with its false comfort, I no longer rely on external safety, only my brain. Because I know the entity is back in my house, forced to inhabit the dark again, without its only electronic tether. The most persistent, unshakable memory I have of those photos? How close the camera was. And how sometimes, the entity taking the photo would subtly, slowly, move its massive head so that it was looking not at the lens, but down at my peaceful, sleeping face. That look of absolute, focused observation is what haunts me most. I know he is here with me again, lurking over the end of my bed when I'm asleep in this dark house, and he is just waiting for me now, without the phone, because soon, I know he will find a way to take the next, final, living picture. And this time, it won't be a selfie not sent. It will be sent straight to the great forgotten archive of all things lost in silence. Story 12. Deep-sea salvage and oceanic surveying aren't just technical jobs. They're psychological experiments. Your mind is constantly playing tricks on you, especially when you are thousands of miles from the shore. My job was marine security for a salvage operation called the Oracle Project, working far into the northern Atlantic. Our vessel was a permanently moored, rusty, deep-water barge, a floating fortress of steel anchored precisely above one of the largest, and officially unexplained, passenger shipwrecks in U.S. history, dating back to 1918. Our purpose was simple: keep other vessels from encroaching on the recovery perimeter, while the deep-sea divers worked 24 hours a day on the wreck below us. We were fixed over the wreck, tethered by an industrial anchor the size of a Ford Explorer, constantly being pulled against currents that demanded a 10-foot-deep piece of steel remain stationary for decades. The entire operation was defined by an extreme, unshakable sense of permanent occupation, being watched from the impossible depths. The conditions were rough, the sea was choppy, the entire steel deck was slick with continuous spray, and the nights were long, cold, and punctuated only by the furious sound of relentless wind and the rain hitting the cold deck like tiny hammer blows on metal. The feeling of being watched was amplified by the unique structure of our base. Every crew member swore that the wreck below us, some 500 feet down in the absolute blackness, was not silent. We all heard it, over the background rumble of the ocean noise on the sensitive sonar systems we employed to map the currents. It was a constant, low, rhythmic, vocal clamor rising up from the seafloor. It sounded like an enormous crowd talking, shouting, or chanting, a vast, garbled, continuous rush of human voices, muffled by stone, water and sand. The divers eventually had a name for it: the chorus of the rusted ledge. They refused to work a dive shift longer than 6 hours, claiming the sonic atmosphere of the wreck drove them to claustrophobic anxiety, a kind of madness caused by too many human connections under too much pressure. But the voices became localized for me during my midnight supervisory shifts. The stern of our barge was designated as the anchor zone, the massive anchor chain descending from an opening in the deck down to the seafloor directly over the sunken ship. The chain was thick, heavy, and covered in years of biofilm and moss from the ocean's depth. On nights when the rain was heaviest and visibility the lowest, I was required to make a structural integrity check of the chain's connections. It was in the anchor zone that the haunting felt physical. Standing over the wide hole where the black chain descended, you no longer heard the chorus. You heard weeping. It was a single, fragile, repetitive female cry, just within the range of hearing, always echoing from the chain's dark perimeter. But the terrifying detail was the grip. Every time I was leaning over that dark, damp opening, gripping the cold steel railing, I would feel a distinct, firm tug, not a bump from the sea, but a steady, cold pressure on my steel railing, moving in a motion that perfectly mirrored the pull of my own hand. It happened 9 times in one particular week, that firm grip and the weeping voice. The 10th time it happened, during a ferocious downpour and howling wind, I screamed and tore my hand off the brass railing instantly as I realized two things at once. 1. The tug was ice cold through my thermal-grade work gloves. And 2. The tug wasn't on the rail. The frigid, grasping pressure I felt was a small, focused hand coming out from the black wetness of the chain itself, clinging tight to my glove. When I looked down at the dark, gleaming chain descending into the depth, the shape vanished. But it left on my right glove a single, clear, black handprint, perfectly formed, small and terribly cold against the ambient temperature of the steel railing. I went straight to our lead project scientist, Dr. Loden, a woman made of logic and skepticism. I showed her the glove with the print. She took the glove, and in her small lab, she ran spectrometric and thermal tests on the print itself. Her eyes were wide with a controlled terror that was far more unnerving than a scream. The final verdict, delivered in a whisper as the rain sounded a muffled drum against the metal sheeting outside the small room. The prints show a localized, momentary flash freezing. It's the composition of human tissue, Captain, but infused with ancient, heavy trace elements only found at the bottom of the ocean. Loden paused, touching the print with a gloved finger. This is not a ghost. This is the physical impression of a body that has rested 500 feet below us for 100 years. Loden's theory sent us all spiraling in a new direction. The 1918 ship was lost mysteriously, all bodies lost at sea. Dr. Loden determined that the single, immovable anchor chain that descended from our barge to the wreckage beneath was acting as a conduit. It was an energy line that didn't just physically hold us in place. It was anchoring us, the living, to the drowned victims, slowly pulling their physical essence up toward the surface in frozen bursts of contact. They weren't haunting us. We were simply being tethered to their suffering. They were not trying to leave. They were acting like anchors of souls, determined to keep the horror, and those connected to it, in the same place forever. I quit the Oracle project after only 9 more days, unable to bear the weight. I sit in my apartment now, a dozen thousand feet above the sea, listening to the rain fall with a sound I once considered a comfort. But now, when the gentle cascade of water hits the pane of glass, it no longer sounds like water. It only sounds like the muffled, vast chorus of 1,000 drowned voices. And every time the weather is cold and the rain is soft, I look at my right hand, knowing that the ghost-cold perfect mark is still with me, not on the glove anymore, but a permanent, frigid memory under my flesh. The anchor chain, I know now, had pulled its load one final time by tethering the deep water fear to my soul. And tonight, with the rain sounding heavier, I know that somewhere in that deep Atlantic blackness, the weeping is intensifying, and the anchors of souls are calling again, knowing I am still bound to the spot.